Can you guys see my screen? I feel
Yeah,
like, okay, great. Just a second. Let me define this box so I can still see the rest of my screen. All right. So thank you again, guys, for having me. And I titled today's and tomorrow's lectures together as Speaking Sylvan. Um, Colonial, contemporary, and indigenous perspectives of conservation was the path that I was focusing on today. And like Majid mentioned, we will run through and contextualize sort of the historical and global politics um, surrounding conservation and green politics, and almost think about it as where they emerged from and the kind of um, the kind of historical background of this sort of thinking. And to start with, I want to show you this quote. In wildness is the preservation of the world. And this is a very famous quote from a very famous man, Henry David Thoreau. And this is a phrase that I think I'd like to come back to often through through these 2 days, and to delve on a lot more in the second lecture. Um, in particular, I want us to think about wildness and wilderness, and what does the phrase really mean, and what is this nature that we speak of, or this wildness that we speak of, that is contrary to the human. Can there really be an imagination of nature without carving out culture from it? And how do these ideas of nature and culture shape green politics? Um, in particular, this separation becomes really important because I think that at some level there's almost a difference in the cosmological way that indigeneity is imagined. And one of those differences is this imagination of human and non-human, and human and environment. And this is something that we will sort of run through both today and tomorrow. Um, but for now, let's just look at this quote to think about the ideas it embodies. The idea that preserving a natural wilderness is necessary for living. Um, and I want to contextualize this particular quote in a long history of environmental thought, and we start by discussing some of that history today. Um, I don't know if you can see this well because I know it's a bit small, but I'll read you through the paths. This is a timeline starting from the 1800s up to the present, and what we see here is this um, sort of the different imaginations of environmental thought that have come about. It starts early in 1800, in the 1800s, where the idea of conservation starts to come up. At this point, a lot of spaces in Europe are running out or starting to run out of forests and wood resources, and this is as the naval sort of the navies are expanding and the requirement for wood is growing. Um, and you have the sort of beginnings of an imagination of conservation. But the idea of conservation here is quite different from the one that we know and think about today. It's a form of conservation that looks at conserving resources like wood, like timber, from forests for a future, so that they can be continually harvested into the future. Um, I've also interspersed these with some incidents from Indigenous life, so you can kind of contextualize what the relationship with Indigenous people at this point is. So in 1830, you see the Trail of Tears, which was this, if some of you know, a huge movement of Indigenous people from western parts of uh, what is now the United States towards the center. And this was sort of a forced migration that was forced by the colonial powers at that point, um, in order to vacate the lands that they wanted to live in. Um, but this is just sort of to give you a context that colonialism has begun in some ways. You have a lot of movement across the world, and you have the sort of battle, which at that point was quite something between the colonial powers and the indigenous people from different parts of the world. In 1836, Emerson writes the book Nature, and Thoreau writes the book Walking. And this is in 1851, Thoreau writes Walking. And this quote is from Thoreau. And this is a point at which there's in the US there is a movement of transcendentalists, a romanticist imagination of nature, and an imagination that going back to nature, quote unquote nature, or to wilderness, is where humans will have salvation. This comes at a point when cities are not in the best conditions, sort of terribly congested, polluted, um, and the idea that the sublime or any relationship with spirituality can be brought about through a return to nature is what this period, like the ideas of this period, sort of symbolize. In 1866, Haeckel writes, sort of coins the term ecology, which is the sort of the first mention in Western literature of an imagination of a cycle of relationships between different beings, and this is sort of like a really important moment. In 1872, following Muir and Emerson and Thoreau and this large scale movement of transcendentalists and romanticists who want to preserve nature for future generations and for health and living and for spiritual reasons. In the US, you have the first national park of the world, the Yellowstone National Park, which is demarcated and defined. Um, to contextualize why this is really important is that national parks became these spaces that were meant to preserve nature or wilderness as it is without humans in it. But the history of Yellowstone, for instance, is a long history of indigenous use, and a large number of indigenous people were pushed out of these parks and continue to be as national parks are formed across the world in order to create this protective, preservative imagination. Simultaneous to this is the development of scientific forestry. Scientific forestry comes from these ideas of conservation, of preserving timber for the future. And what it is a scientific means or an imagination of a scientific means to continually cultivate timber, timber bearing wood, like sort of strong, large woody trees in these forests at a very quick pace so that they can keep being extracted, but also have a chance to sort of come back, um, grow back in time for a second harvest. Um, the big patch you see in red is the part that I'll talk about a little more in terms of the story than anything else, because this is the colonial period of India. Um, I have to explain that the colonial period is when the British took over the country, at, like sort of the Queen, um, uh, sorry, in terms of state. But long before this, you had the um, East India Company, which had already come to India and sort of taken over a lot of lands, fought many battles, and was governing huge portions of land even before the actual beginning of the colonial period. Um, and back as early as 1896, you have Arrhenius, who's speaking about the greenhouse effect. Already the use of coal and the use of the burning of coal and burning of timber is starting to change the climate, and this has already been noted as early as 1896. But of course, this is not something that's being spoken about or being brought into public space, or it's not definitely not the focus of their times then. The Indian Forest Act comes up in 1924. I'll speak about this a little further. And there's a lot of other writing, but one of the sort of cursory bits of writing then is in 1966 when Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring. This was a book that was authored in the UK. Rachel Carson, who was a botanist, sort of for the first time ever, realized that DDT and the fertilizer and sort of pesticides that were being used in fields were affecting the fish, which in turn were affecting the birds. And so she connected this large sequence of events to write a very famous book, which at that point sold more than 2 million copies, um, and spoke about how spring in the UK was becoming silent, and connected all of this to industrialization and to the sort of fertilizer industry that emerged post World War. Um, and this is also the time when you have a lot of sort of, Earth Day is founded for the first time. You have Elric, who writes The Population Bomb, which is an essay that talks about how after a certain amount of population, we will no longer be able to feed ourselves. And all of these come together to create this idea and need, in some ways, to think about conservation or to think about protection of the environment. At the same time, and I call this out because it's such an important and beautiful moment in Indian history, is the Chipko Andolan in India in 1972, which was a women-led movement in the Himachal, where tribal women came out against the harvest of wood by large-scale timber companies. And it's called Chipko because Chipko means sticky. And each of these women just went and hugged a tree, stopping sort of the loggers from logging, and created a huge movement in India, which sort of spread across India to protect forests. Again, this came largely from indigenous people who very much depended on these forests and lived in these forests. Um, and and then of course you have the formation of the IPCC, the Montreal Protocol, the Kyoto Summit, sorry, the Kyoto Protocol, the Earth Summit, all of these sort of large movements which are at the level of intergovernmental and international um, governance that start to think about what we can do to protect the environment. Um, and important movement that I sort of call out here in 2000 is the sort of the increase in popularity of the term the Anthropocene. Perhaps this is something to tag and talk about a little later in this lecture, because it's one of the words that we hear being used a lot. And somehow in this apoliticized way, the Anthropocene, for those of you who might not be familiar, is is sort of this notion of a geological age, which is a geological age where humans have created the geological change. So rather than shifts in the Earth's geology because of climate or pressure, it's the first time that it's this era where we imagine that it's humans and human action on Earth that is changing both the climate but also the geology of the Earth itself. um, but we will come back to that in a bit. And of course, then we have some, important protests. I focus a bit on India because that's where I'm from and that's where most of my knowledge is. But you have the Vedanta protests, one of the sort of large protests against mining in India, again run by indigenous people whose sacred forest was being mined or was planned to be mined then. Um, Similarly, you have the Narmada Bachao Andolan, where a bunch of people, sort of farmers and local stakeholders and indigenous people come together to stop the building of a large dam that will cause a lot of deforestation, but also move them from the lands that they've always known. In 2016, we had Standing Rock, which is a massive and beautiful moment in the United States, where a lot of tribal nations and First Nations from across the United States come together to defend come together with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe to defend and their lands and protect them from an oil pipeline that is planned through these lands. And of course, if of late of 2018, you have the climate strike, which is a wonderful movement that comes about um, from young children, which is an interesting sort of difference than what we see before. But to go back to the period of colonial rule in India and to um, explain a little bit about why this it plays such an important role in the way that conservation is imagined today. Um, I want to talk about these three sort of tools that were tools essential for the governance of the colonial state, and and these tools sort of continue to dictate our relationships with the environment, and our imaginations of how to protect it, or how to work with it. The first is legibility, the second is enactment, and third is dissemination. So I just want to run through a few tools of um, sort of a few ways that these work out. But the tools of legibility essentially would be things like cartography, biology, so anthropology, botany, sciences that survey and think about, measure and observe environmental effects, or environmental and land-based um, uh, environment, sort of plants, animals, land. Um, Enactment tools of enactment tend to be things like legislation, policies, the creation of enforcement agencies. In the world now, a lot of NGOs that fight for environmental rights, forest and wildlife departments, and the tools of dissemination that I imagine, or I want to speak about, are activism, arts and culture, the media, and the sort of role that all of these collectively play. So I want to start with legibility, um, and in this portion, I sort of decided this morning to kind of stick to India and stick to some a more sort of story of India, and of particular of this one site called Biligiri Ranga, where I worked for many years with the indigenous Solega people, whose forest that is. Um, but I want to talk about mapping and the sort of it's in India, the first trigonometrical survey, or the first, and this is actually where the trigonometric survey, which is how we began to map the world, began. It began as a colonial enterprise to bring legibility to lands and to define the extents of their own sort of the lands that they will now own, right? And it began with this massive mapping of the Indian subcontinent, a physical survey of it. And it's interesting to think about here James Scott and his essay on seeing like a state, his book on seeing like a state, which talks about how legibility was an essential um, in creating a system of governance, or in creating rule. And this legibility came with a simplification of the rich and diverse material that exists in the world out there. So, for instance, when there are many stories that you will hear about how the trigonometrical survey was carried out, because you can imagine that you can't really draw a straight line between large portions of land. Um, and there's multiple complex ways of doing it. But in the acts of mapping, there are two instinctive things that happen. One is the reduction of the complexity into a readable document, which conveys both property but also territory, and defines its resources within it. So the second map here is of Biligiri Ranga, and in very fine print at the bottom of the map, I found this in the archives of the Forest Department here, and in very fine print it says that the boundaries of this map were never demarcated on land. The reason that I mention this is because conservation in India meant the drawing out of huge chunks of land, and dislocating all the indigenous populations that lived and depended on this land in order to conserve it for wildlife, but also this begins with sort of the protection of the tiger, which had a hugely declining population in India, and things like that. Um, and it's it's sort of an amazing moment to think about that there's an entire map that draws out the boundaries of the sanctuary, which houses about 4,000 indigenous people, and all of them are moved out of this land, but this boundary has never even been drawn on land. So it's entirely through this act of legibility, through this map making process. The line is drawn on a map, and that dictates how an entire people will live. Um, Another one of the sort of legibility points here during colonial rule was multiple surveys. And these surveys were botanical surveys, they were surveys of the land. And the land was sort of divided up into very manageable and thinkable properties. And so you had marshlands and grasslands, and any form of land that was not cultivable was imagined as waste, and this wasteland was then appropriated by the state as not being used. This and any sort of land that had a large number of trees in it was demarcated as forest. But along with this came very thick botanical surveys that looked at all the plants in the landscape, but in particular focused on plants that had use in the colonial world. So they weren't necessarily plants that you used, for instance, to thatch roofs, but they were plants that could be used for timber, for medicine, for just sale spices, things like that, which could inform and sort of push large-scale trade across the continent. Um, Sorry, I'm going backwards from there. And to explain how the forest was defined, the idea of the forest was that you took a piece of land, um, about 50 meters, and if there were more than 50 trees of a certain girth in them, then that area was defined as forest. And this forest land then, through a multiple sort of a series of legislation, became entirely property of the state rather than open sort of common lands that were being used at that point, both by peasants and farmers around these forests and by forest dwelling indigenous people. Further, the forest is then sort of mapped very clearly, defined as boundaries with compartments within these boundaries. And for each compartment, I don't know if you can see this here, is a list of trees that are valuable to the colonial state and the numbers of those trees that are there in that small block of land in the forest. Um, and this was all the beginnings of scientific forestry that I'd mentioned before. Forestry that was aimed at the growth of these particular species of trees, not concerned with biodiversity or with other animal life, um, but simply with the regeneration of timber in these forests. And the entire system then of mapping the forest was to not look wide and see all the kinds of sort of ecologies and environmental systems that exist in this forest, but very specifically to look at the particular trees that can be sort of harvested and can be sold for profit. And the forest then becomes this extraction landscape, and all the tools of legibility sort of make and define this extractive landscape. But what another thing that does not escape these surveys is people. And people now are starting to be like their customs, their dress, their codes are all starting to be measured and seen, particularly to the extent of anthropological surveys that define, sort of measured people's heads and their noses and created an entire sort of index of the shapes of noses that different indigenous people had. And the entire system of this was to say that if you had a longer, thinner nose or a longer shape of the head, then you were more civilized than if you didn't, right? And so you can imagine that these surveys, which are scientific at this point of time, and if you read the literature and you read the actual surveys, they think of themselves as scientists, as of mapping this entire new land, new people that they do not know and understand. But in the process, they're defining what is civilized and what is not, what is wild and therefore barely human, and what is civilized and closest to the colonial powers. But and I go through this to help you understand that um, it was impossible to govern a people and a place as diverse and rich as a lot of the colonized lands were without these tools of legibility that simplified and also very much put into boxes of colonial imagination what those lands and people consisted of, and how sort of developed or progressive they were, and how much they were just um, could be seen just as nature and therefore exploitable. This is a quick sort of timeline of the changes of the policies that took place during this colonial period. And I want to very quickly run through it, just so you get a sense of what it was like. So in 1805, there is the first sort of enactment of law by the East India Company in a small area that they have. And this is, sorry, this is not from the East India Company. I correct myself. This is from the Mysore government, which through for the first time the imperial government defines the teak tree, which is a very important hardwood tree in the tropical areas of the world. It defines the Tectona grandis or the teak tree as property of the imperial government, which means that across lands that the imperial government governs, any teak tree is property of the government and cannot be used by locals or by the people who have grown it, even if it's not in a forest. This sort of imagination then continues to demarcate at some point through the Indian Forest Act of 1878 all lands that are not cultivated as lands of the imperial state. Um, by 18 sort of by 1927, it means that these lands cannot be people cannot hunt on these lands, they cannot forage on these lands, they cannot depend on these lands for anything in any way. They cannot cut wood here, they cannot use the lands that they depend on, because these are now lands of the state. And this becomes a huge mechanism of sort of criminal, also hunting, foraging, and incarceration of forest dwelling communities, which in the case of India are all largely indigenous communities. But what it does for the Indian state at that point is starts to chalk out on the map areas that are forests that are controlled purely by the government and um, ha- sort of bear no rights for indigenous people. And this idea of conservation, of keeping this land outside of people and outside of indigenous communities, continues in India into conservation in the post-independent state or in the post-colonial state, where instead of these lands being used for harvesting timber, they are now used for the conserving wildlife. Um, and so India gains independence in 1947, and through 1947 and into the future, you see just more and more acts that continue to control the state. There's the In 1952, there's the Scheduled Tribes Act, which starts to take all of these indigenous people and put them in a category of people which have both special sort of services from the government, but simultaneously a lot less control over their own lands. Um, they and this follows up by 1972. You have the Wildlife Protection Act, which means that which sort of dictates, and this is, as you might remember from the larger context of environmental thought, when the idea of conservation was and sort of the green movement was really picking up in across the world. And the Wildlife Protection Act essentially dictates large plots of land, the first sanctuaries or national parks in India, which are reserved areas for the protection of wildlife, where only the forest department is allowed to enter and act, and all others are sort of removed from here. In 1973, you have one of the first conservation ideas in India, which is the Project Tiger, which is a large scale project spread across India to protect wildlife, protect tiger habitats. Um, and this continues into the Conservation Acts of 1980 and 1988. An important movement starts building in 1992, and this sort of extends right all the way up to 2006, um, and continues on today, which is an indigenous movement supported by a lot of non-indigenous people as well, farmers and locals, who say that they have governed their forests much better than the state ever has, and pushes for a community driven management of forest lands and reserved forest lands and sanctuaries. And in 2006, after years of displacement from these sanctuaries, the Forest Rights Act comes about, which basically says that for all people that have been displaced from forest, for all indigenous people and forest dwelling communities that have been displaced from the sanctuaries, they actually have rights to go back and live in the forest. But having said that, each family is given about 1 acre, which is not enough to survive on, and is a very different imagination of land and land rights than the ones that indigenous people, especially in the forest that's drawn here at the bottom, Biligiri Ranga, have. So there, um, the Soleka people of Biligiri Ranga are a nomadic people. They don't travel across large landscapes, but they do not have a fixed idea of home. And so when you relegate those people to a 1 acre plot of land where they can only build their houses there, and they can only sort of use that portion of the forest, and are not allowed to forage, are not allowed to cultivate in other parts of the forest, you still have a huge sort of disconnection where they cannot act upon or protect the lands that make them. And in particular, this condition in Veligiri Ranga is sort of really bizarre because and sort of all and really heartbreaking because these are people who have been shifted around, pushed out of the sanctuary, finally allowed to come back in 2011 after they won a large battle to enter the sanctuary, and still live within extremely curtailed rights where they cannot forage and cannot use fire as a tool to protect themselves or to clear the forest for agriculture. And interestingly enough, they all, in this position in the forest that they are in now, they all become employees, very sort of low level employees of the forest department, and manage the forest on a salary or like on contracts with the state government, doing almost exactly the same things that they did on their own to protect and conserve these forests, but now do it under the state with no agency to make their decisions on what must be done here, but only enact the labor. And this is a story that is at least a story that's definitely one that you can imagine covers a huge portion of India, and most definitely covers a large portion of South Asia. I would say that it extends to communities across the global South, um, but it's really one of those immense stories that need a change in imagination. Mm, the last sort of tool that I want to talk about is the acts of dissemination. Of course, one big portion that I think I've spoken about, but I don't have on the slide, is science. The earliest sort of studies of anthropology, of botany, of zoology, were all acts of making legible the paths of sort of these colonized countries, and through a very particular imagination of human in nature, of important species and unimportant species, of exotic and not exotic, which continues today. If you see, for instance, in Project Tiger, which was the first conservation project in India, you have a keystone species which is deemed important from old colonial times, from when they hunted tigers and stuffed them for their living rooms. And that sort of continues into conservation, which is meant to protect wildlife, where species that are not important or not sort of do not bear significance in terms of the colonized powers continue to be ignored in conservatory, effects to sort of conservatory actions today, conservation actions today. But another form of legibility, a very physical form of legibility that you continue to see in many ways, were zoos and were sort of greenhouses, botanical gardens that continue to be peppered across India and across the world, really, where all of these sort of um, instinctive, all of these indigenous animal species of plants, even people and habitats that were strange to a colonial power or an imperial power, were brought to the imperial states to be on display, in some ways disseminating the very ideas um, of the state and of these the very sort of colonial and racist ideas of people and animals that the colonial state bore. um, I was hoping that you had a chance to read Robin Wall Kimmerer, but since you haven't, I'm going to go through the story that I sent out, which was Robin Wall Kimmerer is an indigenous author from the US, and she writes beautifully. She's also a botanist, and teaches botany. And she talks about, and the story that I wrote about was how, as an indigenous girl walking around indigenous lands, she had a fond relationship with plants and knew a lot of the local plants around where she lived. And as she applied to go to college, she was sure she wanted to study botany. And in her interview, she thought she was being very sort of poetic when she says that she's asked why she wants to study botany, and she says she wants to study botany to see why these two flowers look really beautiful together. And they're asters and goldenrods. Asters are purple and goldenrods are yellow, and they always she's observed them growing together, and she wants to study botany to ask the question of why they look beautiful together. And in this, interview, the professor who's on the other side says, "Oh, that's not botany at all," and relegates her to Botany 101, a class where she felt she already knew all of that information just from having grown up around those plants and with the indigenous information that they sort of the indigenous knowledge that she grew up with. Mm, and over the process, when she writes her master's thesis, she writes about the same question about why asters and goldenrods look beautiful together. And through this scientific study, she comes to realize that there are multiple pollinator species which view these two colors and see them in high contrast, sort of attracting more pollinators to them, and they attract more pollinators to them when they grow together as opposed to when they grow apart, ensuring their continued existence. And her takeaway, in some ways, is, and one of those that I intend to bring about here, is that it's not necessarily the means, it's not necessarily the act of mapping or the act of studying botany or the act of studying zoology, but the questions we ask of science that require sort of a rework or require a change in perspective, or perhaps even an indigenous perspective. And this is just a small quote that she ends with. There was a time when I teetered precariously with an awkward foot in each of two worlds, the scientific and the indigenous. But then I learned to fly, or at least try. It was the bees that showed me how to move between different flowers, to drink the nectar and gather pollen from both. It is this dance of cross pollination that can produce a new species of knowledge, a new way of being in the world. After all, there aren't two worlds, there is just one good green earth. Um, and I wanted to keep the lecture a bit short so that we have a lot more time to discuss, because there's a lot of sort of information that I've just thrown at you, and I'd like to sort of see where you come from. But I want to, at the end of this lecture, just bring up this one thought, and talk a little bit about the current state of environmental thought in the world. And this is from the National Geographic, from an article in the National Geographic, which says that indigenous peoples defend Earth's biodiversity, but they are in danger. Comprising less than 5% of the world's population, indigenous people protect 80% of global biodiversity. And this role is, sort of so important to imagine that the smallest, like a very small portion of the world's population, protects and lives on um, a huge amount of biodiversity. These sort of movements of the question that I want to end on is one of environmental justice and social justice. It's often these indigenous people or the sort of poorest people depending on these resources, um, that are fighting for the protection of these resources from large scale industrial, sort of capitalist infrastructures. And they are met with a huge amount of resistance, state sponsored violence. And I think one of the beautiful parts about green politics, which I will cover a little bit in the next class, is that one of the goals is to look at the intersection of social justice and environmental justice. And I want to end at this question where, since all of us, you know, the idea of that one world that we all inhabit, how is it that we can support, um, amplify, and makes room for voices that are so far unheard, or and often bear the brunt of um, large scale industrialization. Going back to the question of the Anthropocene, which I had mentioned before, one of the reasons that I want us to think about the Anthropocene further and develop it further is that the Anthropocene defines the idea that everybody is equally responsible for the change, for the sort of geological change and for the climate crisis today. And unfortunately, in a world that's not very equal and very, very diverse in terms of consumption, in terms of relationships, in terms of ontologies of living, this isn't true. And it tends to flatten out the fact that you can have somebody, like a tribal in India, like the Solega that I worked and lived with for really long, who operate on a living wage of under $half a day, and have no electricity, um, and have, or are occasionally have electricity, and they just do not have the same role to play in the change, in this large Anthropocene change, that, for instance, someone like me sitting here and being able to have access to internet, and speak to all of you has. And it's this sort of intersection of conservation and the idea of forests and wildlife, overlaid with a set of social issues of people who very much, very closely intersect, and depend on these forests, but also conserve them through their actions and through their lives. Um, it's this intersection that I really want us to think about and explore a little further in the next class. But I'm going to open up for questions, and I just saw a notification that there's been a lot of
Yeah,
questions.
there's a lot of activity. First of all,
So,
thank you so much for that very, really, really insightful and lecture, especially what you're saying towards the end. Of course, the whole climate crisis is massively unequal and unfair. And as you pointed out, sadly, it is something that was created by the privileged few, mainly by those in the global north, but is sadly hitting ethnic minorities and marginalized communities the hardest. And we've got one question, and so far, so I'm sure there'll be other questions. But Chloe, do you want to take yourself off mute and ask a question?
Yeah.
hi.
May have frozen there.
Yeah.
Of this like story or the people, because I have
Chloe, can you repeat your question
yeah,
again?
and I was
Froze.
wondering like
Sorry, your voice is breaking up a lot, Chloe. Maybe what is it the same question you talked about in the chat box?
Yeah, it'd be
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, just yeah,
Okay, so maybe I can read it out.
how the system okay.
Yeah. How is this system of being paid by the forest agency to work on the land with low pay created? And did the indigenous people negotiate this or any discussions to create the system? So, the foundation of the forest department started very early in the colonial period. It was a means to sort of ensure that the policies of the forest, of scientific forestry, were being sort of enacted in the forest, and all the sort of rules of not foraging and not hunting were being maintained. Um, in in the new condition, in these conditions, the indigenous people that depend on these forests no longer being able to have their own sort of processes of living, or are sort of disconnected from their dependencies of the forest. And while they're not being forced into labor here, it's almost like what else can they do? When you have, either you can move out and move to a city to survive, or if you choose to live in the forest, then the little employment you get is what you take, because the 1 acre per family that is granted to you is not enough to grow sort of enough food for your family to survive. And you can no longer forage, you can no longer hunt. So you cannot depend even for lifestyle on the forest that you like you used to before. And so again, it is voluntary in the sense that they can choose not to work for the forest department, but it's not as simple as that, if that answers your question. um, I see that Eduardo has a question of, would it be possible to have ecosystems that own themselves and manage themselves? And these guys think it's possible. I haven't seen the link, Eduardo, but I would like to think that ownership and the imagination of land ownership, at least in India, or at least in the forests of India, came very much with colonial rule. When you speak, for instance, when I speak with Solega elders, um, the way that they phrase it is never an ownership of land, but sort of land that they protect, or land that they depend on, and they don't ever use in their local languages a means of saying that they own it. And so I think that this idea of ownership is something that I question. Um, and one of the things that I hope to like sort of concretize a little more and develop a little further in the next lecture is this imagination that ecosystems have to survive without people. Um, for instance, when I talk about the Solega, there's a huge invasion of lantana in their forest. Lantana camara is an invasive species, which is a species that came from France in under colonial rule to be planted as a decorative hedge. And this is spread across India, not just India, across multiple forests, and taking up space, drawing out more water, killing other local indigenous species that a lot of other insects and animals depend on. Um, and it's sort of choking this forest completely. When lantana was introduced as early as 1800s into this forest ecosystem, it was kept it was fairly controlled, because the Soleka people at that point would burn off huge chunks of it and clear it out to sort of plant small forests there, or sort of do small amounts of cultivation in patches of forest. These patches moved across the forest, so as they move, they would move and clear out different parts of the forest, and this particular species was kept under bay. Um, with the change over the last 50 years, where they have lost their rights to do that and manage their forests because their land has been demarcated as a sanctuary, lantana has just grown wild and has covered all of the forest floor. um, and it's, to me, it's a very important case to imagine that their actions and their cultural lives are very much intersected with that ecosystem. So I'm hoping that when this project addresses that the ecosystem can very much include people, and include human life.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rhea. And is there any other questions?
Okay. Since there aren't, I have a question for you guys. I was hoping to get to know all of you a little more, and be able to attend your presentations where you introduced yourselves. And unfortunately, I couldn't. But I really want to know, in some ways, in if you could take a minute and think out, and then perhaps just write the answers in the chat of what it is that you hope to gain from this next class. I intended for it to discuss nature, culture, and to see the ideas of sort of imagine ourselves in and our environments, and see what effect, sort of, and connect that to the ideas of conservation now, or the ideas of political, ideas of green politics, or the ideas of the political movements for climate change and climate justice, and how it all sort of connects. But I want to know from you guys if that's what you wish to take back. Would you prefer it to be heavy on theory, or would you prefer to sort of like talk a little more on the political history? Um, is that like, maybe you can just take a minute to think that out and then type the answers so that we don't have to worry about internet connections. And Chloe, you have another question. How can we spell the name of this population and the land mentioned? Yes, it's the Solega. I'm going to type it out so you have it. It's the Solega people. Um, and it's a mouthful. The name. It's Billy Giri. Uh, okay. Okay. So I see some answers, and I'm super glad. So that's good. So we can do okay. Interested in ideas or actions to be proposed to critically address the notions of borders, nation, property. Sure. Um, hmm. I want to think about how I can shift the human voice to the landscape, going back to oral storytelling and investigate how language reconstructed, through language reconstructed this myth of humans. Sure, that sounds good, Jill. Um, okay. Yes, Ananya, I very much included ecofeminism in the next lecture. One of the readings that I suggested was Donna Haraway, and I hope you guys get a chance to glance through it. But definitely, um, okay. That helps a lot, you guys. Thank you so much for being here and paying attention. And I'm sorry the lecture was a bit all over the place because I set it up this morning and I felt it was too heavy on history and it's too heavy on sort of theory. And I wanted to go back and just, tell you more about the history so you have a context to think through. Um, but yes, it's really lovely to have all of you here.
Yeah, no, thank you very much as well, Rhea. And we're all looking forward to and hearing more and learning more tomorrow and as well. So tomorrow morning. So thank you very much. And yeah, see you tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Bye, guys.
Bye.
So nice to meet you. Also, feel free to email me if you have not got to the readings or you have any other questions or anything else you'd want to have addressed in the next session.
Just while we've got you here as well, Rhea, like, and are you on? Can you tell people like if you've got a website or any social media handles where people can just find out more about what you're
Okay.
working on and stuff?
Okay. I don't tend to post any of my work. I'm very, very, but I do have a social media handle and I will put that in here, where I occasionally post a little work. I'm in the process of redoing my website, and as soon as it's done, I will share.
No,
Um,
thank you.
but yeah, and also I'm throwing in my email here, so you guys can email if you'd like to hear more or have any specific questions before tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. It was so lovely.
Thank you very much. Just a quick thing, guys, with the tutorials today, you'll see and on the Google Calendar which group that you're in, and basically, so myself and Alexander will also be joining you guys. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, guys, and I will see you guys later on. Thank you.